January 22nd, 1973. Hellinikon Airport, Athens. A small Piaggio P.136 amphibious aircraft taxis toward the runway. On board are 3 men. Donald McCusker, an American pilot being evaluated for work in the Greek air taxi fleet. Donald McGregor, the regular pilot riding as a passenger. And a 24-year-old, who is technically both men's boss, but who at this moment is sitting with his hands off the controls, watching. The young man's name is Alexander Onassis. He is the only son of the richest and most famous man in the world. He is the heir to an empire of ships, oil, private islands, and a legend his father has built from nothing over half a century of limitless ambition. And in the next 30 seconds, his plane will take off, lose control, and crash. Alexander Onassis would never regain consciousness. The following day, he would be dead. He was exactly the age Einstein was when he discovered special relativity. The age Jim Morrison was when he died in Paris. The age Kurt Cobain was when he shot himself. 24 years old. And a single question would float after his death over everything his family had built. What would Alexander Onassis have been if he had lived? This is the story of that young man, not the story of his father, which is the most told story. Alexander's story, the heir who lived in the shadow of the greatest private fortune the 20th century produced, who never quite found his place in that world, who found love in the most unexpected place, and who died before he could decide who he wanted to be. It is also, inevitably, the story of what his death did to his father. Because Aristotle Onassis, the man who had survived the burning of Smyrna, exile, the Great Depression, war, 2 marriages, and decades of commercial warfare with the most powerful men in the world, did not survive his son's death. He died 2 years later, and those who knew him said that in reality he had died the day Alexander closed his eyes in that Athens hospital. To understand Alexander, you have to understand Aristotle. And to understand Aristotle, you have to begin in Smyrna, in September 1922. Aristotle, Socrates Onassis, was born in 1906 in a Greek city of the Ottoman Empire. Prosperous, cosmopolitan, where Greeks, Turks, Armenians and Europeans coexisted in the kind of urban mixture that 20th century nationalism would work so hard to destroy. His father was a tobacco merchant, a successful businessman, and Aristotle grew up in the comfort and pride of a Greek family that had built its place in the world through work and ambition. When he was 16, that world disappeared. Turkish troops took Smyrna. The city burned. Aristotle watched his birthplace turn to ash and refugees. He'd lost 4 uncles, an aunt, and a cousin who burned to death in a church where 500 people had taken shelter. His father was taken prisoner. The family's assets were confiscated. Aristotle Onassis escaped with the clothes on his back and arrived in Greece as a refugee. In 1923, he sailed to Buenos Aires with $250 in his pocket and a Nansen passport, the document issued to stateless persons. In Argentina, he found work as a night telephone switchboard operator, and during the day began building his tobacco business. He listened to the business conversations that passed through his switchboard and used the information to make his own deals. He was the kind of entrepreneur that modern legal systems would have found questionable, but that 1920s capitalism recognized as pure talent. At 25, he was a millionaire. By 30, he had bought his first ships during the Great Depression, when nobody else wanted ships, at the prices he wanted to pay. By 40, he was the owner of the largest private oil tanker fleet in the world. What Aristotle Onassis built in the following decades was more than a fortune. It was a myth. He built the supertankers that redefined maritime transport worldwide. He seized control of the Monte Carlo casino and fought Prince Rainier of Monaco for the principality's economic power. He partnered with Saudi Arabia in oil deals that scandalized Western governments. He purchased the Greek island of Skorpios in the Ionians and transformed it into his private paradise, with imported vegetation, an Orthodox chapel, and the most luxurious yacht in the world, the Christina O, named after his daughter. On that yacht, he received Winston Churchill, Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, Greta Garbo, and Grace Kelly. Maria Callas sang duets with Frank Sinatra as the sun went down over the Mediterranean. It was the kind of life that money alone cannot purchase, because it also requires the specific character that makes those names want to be on the same boat. The world Aristotle Onassis grew up in was not the world of privilege. It was the world of radical loss. The burning of Smyrna in 1922 is one of the most devastating events in modern Greek history and one of the least known in Western history textbooks. The systematic destruction of a city that was the cultural and economic heart of the Greek diaspora in Asia Minor, with a death toll historians continue to debate, but that no one places below tens of thousands. For the young Aristotle, 16 years old, it was also the first great teacher. He learned in those days that everything built can disappear overnight, that systems and institutions that seem permanent are not, and that the only guarantee available is the one you build with your own hands and your own intelligence. That lesson stayed with him forever, and produced the kind of entrepreneur who builds as if the world is ending tomorrow because he once watched it end. When he bought 6 second-hand ships during the Great Depression while everyone else was selling, he was operating with the logic of the refugee who knows the moment to buy is when nobody else wants to buy. When he built the first supertankers, when he signed the Saudi deal that scandalized Western governments, when he seized control of the Monte Carlo casino, he was always applying the same philosophy. Move when others hesitate. Act when the market is still. Ask nobody's permission to do what the analysis says is the right step. Into that world, Alexander Socrates Onassis was born on April 30th, 1948, at the Columbia University Medical Center in New York. His mother was Athena Livanos, known as Tina, daughter of Greek shipowner Stavros G. Livanos, and therefore a member of the same Greek maritime world as his father. Aristotle had chosen Tina in 1946, with the same logic he brought to his investments. She was the daughter of the most powerful man in his circle. She was 17 years old to his 40, and the marriage cemented his position in the elite of Greek shipowners. It was also, in the early years at least, a marriage both described as happy. Alexander was the first child. His sister Christina was born 2 years later in 1950. The two children grew up in a world that textbooks cannot fully describe. Between the Paris apartment on Avenue Foch, the yacht Christina O, the island of Skorpios, the villas in Monte Carlo, the palaces in Athens, they had no home in the ordinary sense of the word. They had a series of extraordinary stages that rotated according to season and their father's business. And in all of them, the central and dominant presence was Aristotle Onassis, the father who had built all of it, who knew everyone who mattered, who filled every room he entered with the specific energy of someone who never doubted the world was his for the taking. Alexander was not educated in any conventional way. He had no fixed school, no permanent classmates, no childhood friendships of the kind ordinary adults recall as the fabric of their early years. Aristotle provided a private tutor and gave him his own apartment from a very young age, something that sounded like an extraordinary privilege, and was also, in terms of psychological development, a peculiar form of solitude. The child who wants for nothing, and who finds it hard for that very reason to build the kind of relationships that are built through shared need. Alexander had the best things in the world, and lacked what developmental psychologists consider most fundamental to growing up: normality. At 16, Alexander failed the entrance examinations for a Paris lycée. It was not academic failure in any strict sense. It was someone who had never learned how to study because he had never needed to. In 1965, at 17, he began working at his father's business headquarters in Monaco. The salary Aristotle paid him was $12,000 a year. $12,000 a year for the son of the richest man in the world. It was a deliberate signal. The father who had built his fortune from nothing was not going to raise an heir who received wealth without understanding what it cost to build. Alexander had to earn his place in the empire. The problem was that neither Alexander nor Aristotle had a very clear idea of what it meant to earn a place in an empire so large that nobody could fully understand it from the inside. An employee at the Monaco office described Alexander as someone who did not seem to be in any hurry to prove he was an Onassis. It was the observation of someone expecting to see in the son the same urgency, the same hunger, the same unstoppable energy that had produced the father. And not finding it. What he found was an intelligent young man, genuinely curious in some very specific areas, automobiles and engines, and technical knowledge of them that reportedly impressed Gianni Agnelli of Fiat, but without the founder's fire. He did not have it because he did not need it. Aristotle's fire had come from the hunger of the refugee who had lost everything, and who built as if the world might disappear again at any moment. Alexander had been born with everything. Fire is not inherited. It is only acquired when fire is missing. The Christina O was in itself a symbol that deserves description. Built originally as a Canadian destroyer, Aristotle had purchased it in 1954 and transformed it into the most famous pleasure yacht in the world. 99 meters in length, 9 luxury staterooms, a mosaic-tiled swimming pool on the lower deck that lifted hydraulically to become a dance floor when the owner ordered it, baths lined in lapis lazuli, an onboard barber shop, a bar decorated with stools upholstered in whale foreskin, according to the legend that some guests verified for themselves. It was the stage on which the Onassis children grew up, among the conversation of Winston Churchill and the jokes of Marilyn Monroe. It was also, from the adult Alexander's perspective, the most luxurious possible prison, the space where his father was the absolute king, and every person present orbited around him. The island of Skorpios, which Aristotle purchased in 1963 for $150,000, was the personal project that spoke most about its owner's character. It was an island of nearly 120 hectares in the Ionian Sea, practically without vegetation when he bought it, which he transformed by personally overseeing the planting of thousands of trees, the building of a small village for the workers, an Orthodox chapel, a main villa, and several smaller cottages. The transformation of Skorpios was the parallel project to his work with Maria Callas. The man who built ships of 100,000 tons of displacement also planted olive trees on his private island and supervised the flowering of the rose bushes in his gardens. He was the same person, with the same energy, applied at completely different scales. The relationship between father and son was that of two people who loved each other and did not understand each other. Aristotle loved Alexander with the intensity of someone who has built an empire to leave to someone and who needs that someone to be his own name. It was the kind of love that is also a form of possession. Alexander was not only his son, he was the vessel for the future of everything he had built. And that expectation, implicit in every conversation, every business meeting, every time Aristotle introduced the young man to partners, generated in Alexander a pressure he himself described in unambiguous terms. I never spent a day without feeling intimidated by the old man's wealth. Aristotle's marriage to Tina Livanos deteriorated progressively through the 1950s. The father's absences, the business that took him from one end of the world to the other, and the relationship Aristotle developed with opera singer Maria Callas from 1957 onward, destroyed what was left of the couple. In 1960, Tina filed for divorce. She was 31 years old. Her relationship with her children became more distant after the separation. Alexander and Christina grew up primarily under Aristotle's influence and presence, with a mother who rebuilt her life in ways her children found difficult to process. In 1971, Tina completed the strangest turn in all of that family history. She married Stavros Niarchos. Aristotle Onassis's archenemy, his decades-long rival in the oil and supertanker wars, became Alexander and Christina's stepfather. It was the kind of twist that the wealthy Greek families seemed to generate, with a frequency that left the rest of the world speechless. The relationship between Maria Callas and Aristotle Onassis is one of the great documented romances of the 20th century, and its impact on Alexander was also significant. When Callas entered Aristotle's life in 1957, Alexander was 9 years old. Callas was the most celebrated opera singer in the world, a woman of an artistic and emotional intensity that matched or surpassed Onassis's business intensity. The two met on the Christina O, and those who were present said the attraction was immediate and total. For years, the relationship between Callas and Onassis was the most closely followed scandal in the international press. Two divorced people, the Greek magnate and the opera diva, traveling the Mediterranean on the most famous yacht in the world. For Alexander and Christina, Callas was simultaneously the reason for their parents' separation and a figure the children found difficult to place in their family life. And then, in October 1968, Aristotle Onassis did what nobody expected, though in retrospect, it should have been predictable. He married Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the 35th President of the United States, the most photographed woman in the world. The image of American mourning turned into an international symbol. The wedding took place on Skorpios on October 20th, 1968, and the world reacted with a mixture of disbelief and fascination that generated front pages in every language. In America, some newspapers ran the headline that captured the collective feeling. "Jackie, how could you?" It was the question of a nation that had turned Jacqueline Kennedy into the guardian of Camelot's legacy, and could not reconcile that image with the marriage to the short, direct-mannered Greek multimillionaire who had built his fortune through methods that the American public found at the very least unconventional. For Alexander and Christina, the marriage was a direct blow. They had held on with the hope of children of divorce who never quite surrender to the inevitable, to the possibility that their father might return to their mother. Aristotle's relationship with Callas had been deteriorating for years and seemed to be ending. The possibility of their parents' reconciliation was improbable, but not impossible. The marriage to Jackie Kennedy made it definitively impossible. The two young Onassis children attended the wedding and smiled for the photographs, with the faces of people doing exactly that, smiling for the photographs. And yet, in those same years, Alexander also found what would be the love of his life. And he found it in the most improbable place, among his mother's friends. Fiona Campbell Walter was a New Zealand model who had been one of the most recognized faces in European fashion in the 1950s. Vogue covers, photographs by Cecil Beaton, who considered her his favorite model, shows for Balenciaga and Schiaparelli. In 1957, she had married Baron Hans Heinrich von Thyssen-Bornemisza, one of the wealthiest men in Europe and the assembler of one of the largest private art collections in the world. The marriage lasted until 1965. Alexander met Fiona for the first time when he was 12 years old and she was a friend of his mother. The age difference between them was 16 years. When Alexander was 18, he invited her to a dinner without telling her she would be the guest of honor, which Fiona found both flattering and unsettling. After dinner they went to a nightclub. A man dancing nearby remarked to Fiona that she was probably with Alexander only for his father's money. Fiona punched him and the man went down. It was the most direct declaration of principles anyone could make in that context. She was not with Alexander because of his father. She was with, or beginning to be with, Alexander because of Alexander. The relationship that developed between the two was exactly the kind of thing Aristotle Onassis could not tolerate. Not because Fiona was unworthy of his son, but because Aristotle Onassis could not tolerate any element of his life, including his children, escaping his control. Fiona was independent, had her own world, her own history, her own financial resources, and had no need whatsoever to please her lover's father. She was the perfect girlfriend for Aristotle Onassis' son, in the sense that she was exactly the person Aristotle Onassis could not manipulate, and that was also the reason Aristotle could not stand her. The father tried to sabotage the relationship in every way available to him. The most obvious was buying Alexander a $2 million villa on the outskirts of Athens, a gesture Fiona described as an attempt to turn her into another of Alexander's objects, to be manipulated and handled on whatever terms the father chose. Fiona established the rule of only accepting gifts that Alexander had paid for with money he himself had earned by working, not with his father's money. It was also, in the psychoanalytic language that biographers of the Onassis family use generously, Alexander's assertion that he wanted to be loved for who he was, not for what his surname represented. In 1971, Aristotle made the decision that was simultaneously the greatest acknowledgement of his son's capabilities and the most effective way of keeping him under control. He appointed him president of Olympic Aviation, the domestic aviation subsidiary of Olympic Airways. Alexander had obtained his pilot's license in 1967, had accumulated 1,500 hours of flight time, and had specialized in medical emergency flights to the Aegean Islands and to mountain villages with difficult access. It was one of the few areas where he had found genuine satisfaction in work. Aviation gave him the sense of control and freedom that the rest of his life inside his father's empire did not. The appointment as president of Olympic Aviation was real, with real responsibilities, and Alexander took it with the seriousness of someone who finally had something that was his within the paternal machinery. In the months before the accident, Alexander had made a decision that would have definitively changed his life had he lived to carry it out. He had told Fiona and those closest to him that he was going to leave Olympic Airways, that he was going to marry Fiona, that they were going to build their own life away from the weight of the surname in a house they had bought together in Western Europe. It was the declaration of independence of a 24-year-old who had spent his entire life being Aristotle Onassis' son, and who had finally found enough clarity to know he wanted to be something else. On January 22nd, 1973, Alexander arrived at Hellinikon Airport to oversee a test flight in the Piaggio P.136 L2, the amphibious aircraft from his personal fleet. Donald McCusker, the American pilot being evaluated for Olympic Aviation's air taxi fleet, took the controls. Donald McGregor, Alexander's regular pilot, was riding as a passenger while recovering from an eye infection. The aircraft took off. It reached approximately 30 meters in altitude, and then the controls stopped responding. The Piaggio rolled to the left, lost lift, and plunged into the airport ground. Alexander was pulled from the wreckage of the Piaggio with severe head trauma. The cerebral hemorrhages were multiple. He was transferred to the Evangelismos Hospital in Athens. Aristotle arrived by plane from New York with a neurosurgeon from Boston. He also had the English neurosurgeon Alan Richardson brought from London. Richardson examined Alexander and told Aristotle what the Athens doctors had already said. The brain damage was irreversible. Alexander had no chance of surviving. Aristotle did not accept that diagnosis. He could not accept it. He sent for specialists from other countries. He had medical equipment brought from Europe and America. For hours, while doctors did what they could with what they had, Aristotle Onassis, the man who had never lost a battle that mattered, sat in that hospital, knowing this battle could not be won. Tina Livanos arrived from Switzerland with her husband Stavros Niarchos, Aristotle's archenemy. It was the strangest image that hospital had ever seen. The most powerful man in Greek maritime history, and his greatest rival sharing the same space of grief over the son of one and the stepson of the other. Christina flew in from Brazil. Fiona arrived. The entire world waited. Medical bulletins were issued with the regularity of wartime communique. And on January 23rd, 1973, at 5:55 in the afternoon, Alexander Onassis died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 24 years, 8 months, and 23 days old. The subsequent investigations determined the cause of the accident with a precision that made it harder, not easier, to accept. During the installation of a new control column, the aileron cables had been connected the wrong way around. When the pilot moved the controls in one direction, the ailerons responded in the opposite direction. It was a maintenance error, negligence in the installation of equipment. 6 Olympic Airways mechanics were prosecuted for negligence. The cause was so banal, so far removed from any narrative of fate or destiny, that Aristotle Onassis refused to accept it. The mind that had navigated decades of brutal competition in international markets could not accept that his son had died because of a cable connected backward. Aristotle offered $1 million reward in a paid newspaper advertisement to anyone who could prove his son's death had been deliberate and not accidental. He accused the CIA. He accused the Greek military junta's leader, Georgios Papadopoulos. He accused Niarchos. He accused the Olympic Airways mechanics. It was the reaction of someone who could not live with the truth, that his son had died through carelessness, through a wrongly connected cable, through the ordinary negligence of a badly executed maintenance job. Conspiracy was more bearable than banality. The legal proceedings that followed were another episode in Aristotle's refusal to accept the official version. McCusker, the American pilot at the controls at the moment of the crash, faced manslaughter charges filed by the Athens prosecutor less than a month after Alexander's death. 6 Olympic Airways mechanics were also prosecuted for allegedly defective installation of the controls. In November 1977, 2 years after Aristotle's death, the 3-member Criminal Court of Athens acquitted all the accused. McCusker received $800,000 from Olympic Airways as compensation in 1978, 3 years after Aristotle's death. Aristotle, never knowing the case had ended in acquittal and financial compensation to the man he had accused of killing his son. The marriage with Jacqueline Kennedy, which was already not working before Alexander's death, became afterward a relationship of armed truce. Christina, who had hated Jackie from the start, convinced her father that the Kennedy widow brought a curse with her. John Kennedy had been assassinated, Robert Kennedy had been assassinated, and now Alexander. The superstition, in which Aristotle would not have believed in normal times, found fertile ground in his grief. Aristotle began negotiating a way out of the marriage. Jackie, for her part, lived in her own apartments and led her own life with an independence that Onassis's money facilitated. The marriage would officially end only with Aristotle's death. The myasthenia gravis, the autoimmune disease that attacked Aristotle's neuromuscular system in the years following Alexander's death, was, for the doctors, a consequence of the immune collapse that extreme stress and profound grief can produce. For those who knew him, it was simply the physical translation of something already visible to the naked eye. Aristotle Onassis no longer wanted to live. The man described for decades as the most irrepressible energy in any room he entered became someone who went silent in the middle of conversations, who cancelled meetings, who spent hours on the island of Skorpios sitting by his son's grave. In March 1975, exactly 26 months after Alexander's death, Aristotle Onassis died at the American hospital in Paris, at Neuilly-sur-Seine. The official cause was respiratory failure from complications of myasthenia gravis. The real cause, according to everyone who knew him, was that he found no reason sufficient to keep going. Aristotle Onassis's will left 45% of his fortune to the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation, created in his son's memory. The rest went to Christina. Jackie Kennedy received what had been contractually agreed. Some sources say $10 million, others $25, negotiated by Ted Kennedy. Christina had to pay it to prevent Jackie from contesting the will. It was the last transaction of a marriage that had begun as the most surprising news story of 1968 and ended as a notarial settlement agreement. Christina Onassis, Alexander's sister, lived 15 years longer than he did with the feeling of being the sole survivor of a family that was dying out at a speed that defied any calculation of probability. Her mother, Tina, died in October 1974 in Niarchos's Paris apartment of a barbiturate overdose that was officially ruled an accident, but generated the same conspiratorial doubts that had surrounded the death of his first wife, who was also Tina's sister. Christina died in November 1988 in Buenos Aires at 37 years old of an acute pulmonary edema related to her cardiac problems. She left a daughter, Athena, born in 1985, and heir to a fortune that made her one of the richest women in the world before she turned 3. The Alexander S. Onassis Foundation, headquartered in Vaduz, Liechtenstein, with its main offices in Athens, was and remains one of the most active philanthropic foundations in the Greek world. It funds academic scholarships, cultural programs, theatrical and operatic productions, academic publications on Greece and the Hellenic world. It bears the name of a young man who never finished high school, who worked for $12,000 a year for the man who controlled hundreds of millions and who died before he could decide what he wanted to do with his life outside his father's surname. It is the most enduring form of a father's grief, building in the name of someone who could not build for himself. The question of who Alexander Onassis would have been if he had lived has no answer, but it has possibilities. He had said he wanted to marry Fiona von Thuysen. He had said he wanted to step away from his father's empire. He had 1,500 hours of flight time and a genuine passion for aviation. He had the technical knowledge of engines and automobiles that had impressed Gianni Agnelli. He had the intelligence of someone who had grown up in the most sophisticated business world on the planet, even if he had never learned to put that intelligence in the service of a project of his own. He was someone in the process of finding himself when the process was interrupted. And that, more than the accident itself, is what makes his story so painful. He died at the exact moment he was beginning to know who he wanted to be. Fiona von Tyson survived Alexander and lived the following decades with the discretion of someone who had witnessed something too large to reduce to interviews. Those who knew her in those years described her as someone who carried her pain with the same dignity she had brought to everything else. The man who had punched a dancer for doubting her motives was gone, and the question of what the two of them might have been without Aristotle Onassis between them is another of the things Alexander's story cannot answer. On Skorpios, the island Aristotle built as a symbol of everything he had achieved, the father and son are buried together, the two Onassis men who were everything and nothing simultaneously, the one who built the world and the one who was born into it. There is something in that image, the two names together in the same ground on a private island in the Mediterranean, that speaks to the Greek tragedy more clearly than any work of Sophocles. The hero who survived everything, the son who did not survive to 25, and between them the silence of what never came to be. The rivalry between Aristotle Onassis and Stavros Niarchos is also part of the indispensable context for understanding Alexander's life. Niarchos was the other great Greek shipowner of the post-war period, Aristotle's brother-in-law, because he was married to Eugenia Livanos, Tina's sister. The two built their empires in parallel, competing for the same oil contracts, the same shipyards, the same records for vessel size. It was the rivalry of two men with the same business intelligence and the same need to be first. When Tina, after divorcing Aristotle, married Niarchos in 1971, the rivalry acquired a personal dimension that neither of them could have calculated when it started. And Alexander, who had to relate to Niarchos as his stepfather, was at the center of that tension in ways that none of the adults involved appears to have managed with the sensitivity the situation required. There is an image that captures the life of Alexander Onassis more completely than any other the photographic archives preserve. It is from 1953, when Alexander was 5 years old. His father had just launched in Hamburg the Tina Onassis, a 45,000-ton supertanker named after his mother. The 5-year-old boy was brought to take part in the ceremony. In the photographs, Alexander can be seen holding the champagne bottle that strikes the ship's hull. It is the image of the heir launching into the world, the symbol of his father's power. It was also, without anyone in that moment being able to know it, the image of the boy whose name would later be carried by the most important element of that same father's legacy. Twice, the same name on two enormous things. The ship his father launched in the year of his birth, and the foundation he built after there was no heir left to inherit. There is a last thing worth saying about the story of Alexander Onassis that no available document can fully capture. It is the image of Alexander piloting one of his small aircraft toward a remote Aegean island to bring someone who needed a hospital. The son of the world's richest man, with 1,500 flight hours and a medical emergency license, landing on a dirt strip beside a mountain village to collect a patient. No witnesses, no cameras, nobody who would recognize him by his surname. Just the pilot and the patient and the plane and the Aegean horizon. It was the life he could have had. It was also, during the hours those flights lasted, the life he truly had. And yet those medical emergency flights were also an involuntary metaphor for Alexander Onassis's entire story. Someone who had too much of everything the world considers valuable, finding meaning in the simplest and most concrete thing available, arriving in time, getting the patient to the hospital, the plane responding, and the landing coming in clean. Not the legacy of the surname, not the weight of the empire, just the immediate real work of someone who knew how to fly and who used that skill to do something that mattered beyond a company balance sheet. It was the Alexander who could have been, given more time, the one Fiona knew, the one who would have built something small and real somewhere in Western Europe, away from the weight of being Aristotle Onassis' son, the one who left too soon for the world to know he existed. If this story has reached you, if at any moment you felt the weight of that question about what Alexander Onassis might have been? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think he could have built something of his own, outside his father's shadow? Or was the shadow too large for any person? The debate is open. And if you want more about the sons and daughters of the world's most powerful men and what that inheritance cost them, this channel has more stories. Subscribe.